We have a mechanism in this bill which will force all of us across the political spectrum to do everything we possibly can to make sure those promises are kept. And it's not in this amendment. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Thank you. I appreciate my colleague from Texas and his earnest desire to solve the problems in front of us. And I would say at the outset, the recognition over the last 8.5, 9 years of being in the Senate is that we have a problem that we need to solve, and I don't think anybody disagrees with that. But I think there's two important points that the American people expect us to pay attention to. One is what Reagan described as the shining city on a hill, and that people coming here make us better. There's no question about that. And that what he described was, what he wanted was, in 1986, was not all walls, like some people wanted, and not all doors, like some people wanted, but a wall with doors. And so there's two basic facts that confront us. One is that the rule of law is the glue that holds us together. And when we hear talk about the American people having confidence on whether or not we're going to enforce the rule of law, whether it's on immigration or any other thing, the very fact is that fabric that is holding this nation together is being stretched very thin right now. And the last thing we should do in an immigration bill is to stretch that fabric further in terms of the confidence of the American people in terms of the rule of law. And this bill and this amendment is full of holes as far as the rule of law is considered all throughout. My colleague from Texas outlined some of that. He also outlined the capability of waiving the border fence, waiving the requirements for RPI status. It's all written, but it's written so that the Secretary of Homeland Security can waive almost every portion of it. So that's not the rule of law, that's the rule of rulers. And whatever the rulers decide. One of my great disappointments in the Senate is that we too often don't follow regular order. And so this bill was put together, it went through the Judiciary Committee, but not once did it come through Homeland Security. Homeland Security, where Border Patrol, where ICE, where USIS, where all the implementation of anything that's in this bill will take place. Oh, and by the way, all the knowledge, all the experience of all the members on that committee for the last 10 or 12 years, with the exception of Senator McCain, was not utilized in putting this bill together. So what we have is some very good effort and well-intentioned effort by a lot of people to do some things. Let me just outline where they've got it wrong. And I will ask permission in a little bit. Actually, I'll ask it right now. The National Association of Former Border Patrol Officers, a letter denying the fact that we need 20,000 additional Border Patrol. Here's the people who know. And they say, how stupid is this? What we're doing is we're throwing money hoping it'll stick on a wall and hoping we can convince our colleagues that we've got a border security plan when in fact there's no border security plan in the United States today. And how do I know? Because 2 weeks ago I had breakfast with Secretary Napolitano and I asked her to send, she said she would, sector by sector border plan for the United States. And I got a 2-page letter that had nothing in it. So this isn't a new border plan. This isn't a specific border plan. The country doesn't have one right now. So we've put together, outside of the regular order, well-intentioned people trying to solve a problem to assure the American people that, in fact, we're going to secure our borders. Now, I will readily admit to you that if I lived in the poverty of some of the Central American nations, that I would make every effort on my part to get here, legally or illegally. Because the opportunity is here. That opportunity to improve yourself, that opportunity to work hard, that opportunity to live in a nation that has a justice system where the rule of law reigns supreme. The very irony of the fact that if I were from one of the Central American countries and came here, the very irony would be the fact that I'm going to break the law that is the very nurturing thing that gives the opportunity for me to advance for me and my family. I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the letter of the National Association of Former Border Patrol Officers.
Without objection.
Now, what has Senator Cornyn outlined that does not fit with common sense? He said that people who commit 3 misdemeanors, whether it be child abuse or spousal abuse or drunk driving, shouldn't be given an RPI status. Yet, under this bill, you can do that. And for those that are not familiar with courts of laws, it's on the date. So if you got 2 on one date, that only counts as 1. So theoretically, you could have 10 or 12 misdemeanors and still qualify for RPI status. How does that fit with the rule of law? How does that fit with the glue that holds us together? What that does is flaunt the rule of law. The other thing that I think is very problematic in this bill is we have 20,000 Border Patrol agents, but no increase in ICE agents, no increase in USCIS, which are the very people that are going to have to handle the 11 million people here who are going to get or progress to RPI status. So where's the money to handle 11 million people, additional people for ICE and USCIS? It's not in there. If, in fact, we want the rule of law to work, then we want the people who qualify under this bill for RPI status to do so under the rule of law, which means you have to investigate and do a background check and make sure that the documentation establishing them being here before December 31st of 2011, that in fact they do have residence here, that they in fact have worked here, and that has to be worked on. That can't just be a blanket, because the opportunists to take advantage of that system, if in fact there's no ICE agents and there's no USCIS agents to actually handle that, means that everything that's been set up in this bill will just happen without an investigation, without knowledge that it's a true and in fact people qualify for RPI status. The other side of the bill that Senator Cornyn made a point about, which I would like to expand upon, is the fact that we're not going to have an entry and exit visa system, because 80% of the people go through the land ports, and this bill exempts those land ports totally from that. And you heard Senator Cornyn talk about 40%, maybe even 50% of the people who are here illegally today came here legally. They came here legally with a visa. They qualify for a visa, and they've overstayed their visa. Well, if in fact we have no internal enforcement, no ICE agents to enforce the visa overstays, we won't change that. The CBO even said you're going to have 7.5 million new illegals come across, undocumented, come across under this bill. And if you have no internal enforcement, there's no way to drive that number down. And yet this bill puts the resources in the wrong place. You control a border by controlling the border based on what the situation is on the border, depending on location, geography, topography, and access. So throwing 41,000 Border Patrol agents across our southern border might work but it's a tremendous waste of resources. It might be a jobs program. But the fact is it takes a combination of technology, fencing, border patrol, and the right combination for wherever we're talking about to be effective in operational control of the border. But that's not even a part of the bill. It's not part of the bill to have operational control of the border with 90% effective rate. And one of the reasons that we can't get there, which is one of the things that Americans would like to see us promise in this bill, is because our control of the border today is somewhere between 40 and 65%. That's opposite of what the Secretary of Homeland Security will tell you, but that's what the studies outside of government say when they go to interview those undocumented workers that are here today. And they did a very thorough analysis of that and said we're somewhere between 40 and 65%. So the basis of allowing undocumented workers and those that are in our country who can contribute greatly to our country, the basis of putting them on some type of status to move towards a green card status and ultimately citizenship has to be based on some real facts. Now, why would somebody not agree to 90% control of the border? The only way, the reason they would not agree to it is they don't think it's achievable. And the only reason it's not achievable is because we don't have the political will to do it. It is technically achievable. You can't get to 100%, but you can easily, with good leadership, good sector-by-sector planning, good internal enforcement, and great legal immigration, so you decrease the illegal, we could get there. Now, why is that not part of this bill? Is because the rule of law does not reign supreme in the U.S. Senate. Let me make a couple other points. One of the big holes in this bill, in Section 1202, grants the Secretary, says the following: the Secretary shall initiate removal proceedings in accordance with Chapter 4 of Title II of the Immigration Nationality Act, 8 U.S.C. 1221, confirm that immigration relief or protection has been granted or is pending, or otherwise close to 90% of the cases of immigrants who were admitted to the United States as non-immigrants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that means is she can waive the requirements under the bill. She can waive the fence. All throughout this bill, we're letting a non-elected individual with power to undermine every aspect of any tooth in this bill. You know, when the immigration debate started, my hope was that we would do the principle that most Americans want us to do, which is we need to solve the problem of the undocumented in this country. We need to bring them out of the shadows. But the price to do that is cogent and realistic control of our borders. And let me make a point. If, in fact, you don't have cogent and realistic control of your borders and you do everything else in this bill and everything works as the authors want it to work, guess who's going to be coming across the border? The very people we actually don't want here. The drug runners, the human smugglers, the criminals, the terrorists. So when I say 90% operational control of the border and I'm in Oklahoma, people look at me and they're askance. They say, well, that means 10% of the people are still coming. And guess what makes up that 10%? The worst of what tries to get into this country. So it's not just about getting a border security plan to secure a border. It's about limiting the access of the criminals and the terrorists and the worst from coming into our country. This bill's going to allow that to continue. It's not going to stop that. It will continue. And the only way, and I think Senator Cornyn's point, what you need is to take this out of the political arena. We need to make it so that the pressure is that we do what's best for America. And one of the things that's best for America is having a lot more people come here and contribute to our melting pot. There's no question about that. But we have to have it where it's cannot be manipulated by whoever's in charge for political benefit. And that's why the Cornyn plan really is novel in terms of actually solving the problem. I'm not going to be here much longer, less than 3.5 years. But I can already predict what's going to happen if this piece of legislation comes through. My daughters and their husbands, 15 years from now, are going to be listening to the same debate on the Senate floor. The biggest deficit that the Senate has, in my mind, is failure to put teeth into things they know will actually fix the problems in this country. This bill has no teeth. This bill has $48 billion thrown up against the wall to buy the votes to say we're going to have a secure border, when in fact we're not. It doesn't mean we can't get a secure border. I worked for 2 weeks with my staff. I told Senator Schumer from New York, I'd love to try to do that, but in 2 weeks you can't do it. What you've done, you haven't done it either. And you've done it from a deficit of knowledge rather than using knowledge. You didn't use any of the significant historical staff on the committee of jurisdiction to help write this legislation. The institutional knowledge is not in it. It will not succeed. I don't know ultimately how I'll vote on this amendment, but I'm certainly not going to vote to proceed to this until we've had a chance, more than 72 hours, to actually work through and be able to ascertain and also share the flaws in the approach. For a third that amount of money, you could easily secure the border. And we're going to spend $48 billion. And in there is another jobs program adding to the 102 we have now at $1.5 billion. GAO has already said we need to redo our jobs program. What we have an earmark for another youth jobs program, and we won't even fix the youth job programs we have now. Madam Chairwoman, Madam President, I've been handed a note that others want to speak, and so I will yield the floor at this time.
Madam Chair, what is the status in terms of time that's left for each side?
The proponents of the measure retain 25 minutes. Opponents have 7 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Madam President. And I just want to rise in strong support of the Corker-Hoeven amendment. I have listened carefully to those who are opposed, who have come to the floor today and Friday, and I've come to one conclusion. They just won't take yes for an answer. They just won't take yes for an answer. Most of the criticism that's come at this amendment is it does too much for the border. Even some of my colleagues who are opposed say it does too much, even though they propose similar things themselves. My good friend from Texas says we don't need more border agents, but had proposed $5 billion himself. My good friend from Texas also said, well, we really need technology, but there was no technology in his bill. And my dear friend Senator Coburn, who I very much like and admire, first says we need money for ICE agents, not Border Patrol. But ICE is funded to deport about 400,000 people a year. Well, Most of the 11 million will become citizens and not be deported. We have more than enough ICE agents to deal with this much smaller number who are going to be here illegally, certainly in the beginning, and I think throughout the bill. Dr. Coburn said we don't have more money for USCIS officers. We do. $3.6 billion more. And finally, Dr. Coburn talks about the trigger. Look, let's face it. For many on the other side, the number one priority is securing the border. For many on our side, the number one priority is achieving a path to citizenship. The bill proposed by the Gang of Eight, we believe, did both. But certainly, there were many on the other side who thought that the amount we were putting into border security wasn't enough, wasn't adequate, so we were willing to augment that in the Corker-Hoeven amendment, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But certainly, what we don't want to do is choose one in place of the other. And the problem with the 90%, which Senator Cornyn proposed, was that under many different types of scenarios and circumstances, an act of God, an administration that was decidedly against a path to citizenship and counted things differently or held up the count, you could envision no path to citizenship. That was out of the question for us. And so what we tried to do is say you can have both. And we also said we're going to do border security first. But what we made sure in the triggers, and there are 5 triggers now with the amendment in this proposal, is make sure that the triggers could not be used deliberately by somebody who was opposed to the path to citizenship as a way to block them, whether that be a Congress or a president or somebody in the administration. And so we've come up with the right compromise. We have not split the baby in half, which is what Senator Cornyn and I gather Senator Coburn want to do. We have had both. We have satisfied those who are for border security and those who are for a path to citizenship. And only when you satisfy both will you get a bill. You can't do it with one and not the other. So let me go over the border security part here and why it will work. First, to say that the experts were not consulted, as my good friend from Oklahoma said, is really not fair, particularly to Senators McCain and Flake, who are probably greater experts on what is needed at the border than any of us. They may not be chairman or ranking member of the committee, although I believe that Senator McCain is on that committee, but they live on that border. And to boot, Senator McCain has tremendous military experience in terms of surveillance. And what we have done is looked at each sector. There are 9. They're different. The senator from Texas's sector has a river and has private property that goes right up to the edge of the river. It would take 30 years to build a fence on that side of the property because you'd need eminent domain, and I'm sure there are some ranchers who say, I don't want a fence on my right by the river. That's where my cattle come graze and drink. There are parts of the Arizona sector that are heavily populated, where a strong fence is needed. And there are parts that are so rugged and have no roads, that a fence would be a waste of money. And what our bill relies on is different approaches in each of the 9 sectors, but the best approach. And that didn't just come out of the air. That came with Senator McCain sitting down, working with Senators Hoeven and Corker, but also working with the Department of Homeland Security, as well as those who work in the Border Patrol as to what is needed, and that is in the bill. We heard the objection that from others that they don't trust DHS, either this one or a new one, to implement what is needed, so it's in the amendment. Now, why do you need so many men on the border and women on the border? Why do you? Well, let me explain. Our American people demand that we really make the border airtight. That's why some have proposed a 2,200-mile fence double. That's what they wanted. The cost would be in the, I think it might go to the hundreds of billions, but it also wouldn't work in many areas for the reasons I mentioned. But they want it airtight. So here's what we have. In the air, we have adequate eyes in the sky, whether it be drones or airplanes, so that every person, every single person, 100% observability, 100% situational awareness is what it's called. Any single person crossing the border will be detected. Every single person. Whether it's night or day, whether it's sunny or stormy, the technology, not available 10 years ago, allows us to do just that. And then we have proposed a large number of Border Patrol. It is true. There are enough agents that 24/7 you could station somebody on the border every 1,000 feet, all the way from the western edge of the border in San Diego, California, to the eastern edge of the border in Brownsville, Texas. Why? Because the minute one of those eyes in the sky detects someone approaching the border, there'll be an adequate personnel there to say, we'll detain you or turn them back. It's obvious. It's what the experts tell us will work, and it's very explainable to the American people. So yes, there's a lot of resources on the border. And yes, each of us, if we wrote the bill, might do it in a different way or put in more money or less money. But no one can dispute that the border becomes virtually airtight. Virtually airtight. And that means those who cross the border will be few and far between. Now, two things else I'd like to mention. It's expensive. And this bill and this amendment doesn't come cheap. But the CBO report was a game changer because it said what everyone understands, but it verified it. It gave it the good housekeeping seal of approval. We all know one of the great economic engines of America, or we should all know, many of us do. I know the President, Madam President, you know it, being an immigrant yourself, that one of the greatest economic engines America has had to propel it and make it the greatest country in the world are immigrants. Immigrants are willing to risk everything. They cross stormy oceans, trek across deserts to come to America. What a beautiful, wonderful thing. I'm so proud that out my window of my den in Brooklyn, New York, I can see that lady who holds the torch. And to the whole world, she symbolizes what a great country we are. And people come. Anyone who doubts whether America, the sun is setting on America, just look at how many people risk their lives to come here, how many people separate from families to come here, how many people uproot themselves to come here. If America weren't such a great, attractive place, we wouldn't have a problem of so many illegal immigrants. People want to come here. And when they come here, they work. Boy, do they work. You know, to be able to send $10 a week to your mother or kids in Oaxaca province, or in the Philippines, or in Bosnia, is a huge thing. It gives you joy. That's why they're sometimes willing to work under the kinds of conditions we don't find acceptable for people who are here legally. But it's the greatest economic engine there is. Immigrants form companies because so many of the smartest and brightest come here. Immigrants make our meat factories and our farms work because even those who may not have such an education are willing to work under this very difficult conditions to earn enough money to feed themselves and maybe send a little home to their families. They're the greatest economic engine we have, the greatest. Republicans say the way to get this economy going, cut taxes. Democrats say the way to get this economy going, spend money. You can decide, folks, which one you believe in. But I'll tell you this, no one can dispute that a greater economic engine than either of those is the blood, sweat, toil, and tears of our immigrant communities, not just starting today, but from the day in my city when the new immigrants were called English, because the Dutch had settled New York and didn't want these newcomers to come in. In fact, the two oldest high schools in America are in New York City. They're both private schools, but one is called Collegiate. It was formed by the Dutch Reformed Church in 16-something. 38, I think. I don't know. I ask unanimous consent to get the proper date and put it in the record. And when the English came, they didn't want to go to a school with this Dutch Reformed Church, so they formed the Trinity School for the Episcopal English, the Anglican English. And there was all kinds of tension. Of course there's always tension. But when these new English people came, they worked hard, and the Dutch saw that. Peter Stuyvesant recognized it and made New York, actually, the reasons many have written we've become the greatest city in the world, because unlike other cities, we would take everybody as long as they worked hard. It's one of the reasons my people settled so heavily in New York in America. And it was a tradition that lasted a long time. Boston was bigger than New York, Philadelphia, but they were closed to outsiders. New York was open. And so, the greatest economic engine America faces, America needs, rather, are immigrants and their hard work, whether they're PhDs in nuclear physics or cutting sugar in Florida or Louisiana. And CBO vindicated that report. Amazing. We're busy talking about Mr. Bernanke and how he could twist the dials and GDP growth might go up 0.3%. You know what CBO, the impartial CBO, showed? If we did our bill, which both brought 11 million workers out of the shadows and brought hundreds of thousands more in the next decade, millions more in, whether through the Future Flow program or family unification, GDP would go up 3.3%. I know of no government program or tax cut that even professes to do that much. And in the second decade, it would go up over 5%. So, of course, this is good for America. And we want to secure our borders, and we want to rationalize our system, and we want to be fair on a tough but earned path to citizenship for those who cross the border illegally. And the bill, with the addition of the Corker-Hoeven amendment, can convince everybody they do it all. And one other point. Those who said, well, this new Corker-Hoeven amendment will cost money. Well, it will. But let me read you what CBO has just said in the last half hour. The amendment, Corker-Hoeven, would significantly increase border security relative to the committee-approved version of the bill, and it would strengthen enforcement actions against those who stay in the country after their authorization has expired. Therefore, CBO expects that relative to the committee-approved version, the amendment would reduce both illegal entry into the country and the number of people who stay in the country beyond their end of their authorized period. I say that to my colleague from Texas who's on the floor and others who say, this won't work. CBO, illegal immigration, will decline as a result of the Corker-Hoeven amendment. And here's something else CBO says. All told, CBO and JCT, Joint Tax Committee, Joint Committee on Tax, expect that enacting the amendment would, like enacting S-744, the base bill, reduce the federal deficit over the next 10 years and the second decade following enactment. Fewer illegal immigrants, higher GDP, more jobs, reduced deficit. Who could oppose that? I don't know of anybody, Madam President, if they care about America. And so once again, on the border stuff, my colleagues just won't take yes for an answer. This is the toughest, strongest, most expensive border provision that we have had It is augmented, of course, by the exit-entry system improvements and the mandatory E-Verify, which many of my colleagues, including my good friend from Alabama, has been calling for a long time. Illegal immigration will drop dramatically. GDP will go up, jobs will go up, and the deficit will go down. Pass this amendment and pass this bill. It's good for America. I yield the floor.
I know my place. I know my place. Madam President.
Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, at 5:30 today, the Senate is going to vote on the modification to the Leahy Amendment, which is the package put together by Senators Hoeven and Corker. And the distinguished senior senator from New York, who has led the so-called Gang of Eight in putting together this bill, is on the floor and has just spoken, as has the, or will, I believe, the distinguished majority whip, who's on the floor. Now, I indicated on Friday when I spoke about this, this is not the amendment I would have drafted. I think every one of us, if we drafted the bill, each one of us would draft it differently. But Republicans demanded these aggressive border measures to secure their support for the overall legislation. And while it means spending an enormous amount of money, because their amendment will increase Republican support by spending this money for this historic comprehensive legislation, I will support it. Ultimately, the comprehensive legislation is the most important thing. I appreciate that this package includes a provision that Senator Murray and I have worked on, takes an important step toward restoring privacy rights to millions of people who live near the northern border. Over the past decade, the Department of Homeland Security has periodically set up a Border Patrol vehicle checkpoint nearly 100 miles from the Canadian border in Vermont. Many Vermonters have questioned whether this is an effective border security measure, whether it is just a waste of money, and why we are doing this when 100 miles from the friendliest border any country has ever known. My provision will make significant progress in addressing that checkpoint by injecting some oversight into the decision-making process for operating checkpoints so far from the border. While this is an important step in the right direction, I am disappointed that the version in the Hoeven-Corker amendment is limited to the northern border, and I'll continue to work on this issue so that all Americans can have their privacy rights protected. Most of us appreciate our privacy rights and don't like to be stopped for no particular reason. Today's vote for cloture of this Republican package is a vote for bipartisan support for comprehensive immigration reform. It is a vote in favor of taking the bold steps needed to confront the current situation and give the many millions of people living in the shadows the opportunity to come into the lawful immigration system. And I applaud those senators, both Democrats and Republicans, who have come together to get us here. Now is the time for this whole body to come together in support of fixing a broken immigration system that hurts all of us. It stifles our economy. It keeps our families apart. We've gotten to this point through compromise. But we have not compromised on the core of this legislation that is intended to set so many on the path to become full and lawful participants in American life. And in that spirit of compromise and cooperation, which we fostered through 140 amendments, almost 140 amendments agreed to by bipartisan votes in the Senate Judiciary Committee, I will support this amendment and will urge my colleagues also to support it.
Mr. President. Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Madam President, I want to thank the Senator for his leadership on this issue, and I want to make a few brief comments in support of the amendment. First of all, to those who've been traveling and are just coming in, this is a cloture vote on the amendment only. There'll be further cloture votes down the road. This amendment was 115 pages long in ledge language. It takes about 30 minutes to read. We've had it out there for 75 hours, so people have had plenty of time to look at this. But let me just say, especially to my colleagues on this side of the aisle, what this amendment is should be measured against is the base text of this legislation. The border plan, the border security piece, would be put in place by the head of Homeland Security. Right now, that's Janet Napolitano. She'd have 180 days to put that in place. And then the trigger 10 years down the road is that the Homeland Security person says that it's 90% in place. What this amendment does is put in a much stronger border security regime. It has 5 triggers in it before anyone can receive a green card. Number one, 20,000 Border Patrol agents deployed, trained, and in place. Secondly, $4.5 billion worth of technology that is necessary for us to get 100% situational awareness on the border. Thirdly, 350 miles of new fencing on top of the 350 that we now have. Fourthly, E-Verify system being fully implemented and in place. And fifthly, fully implementing an entry-exit visa program, which is one of the reasons there have been so many overstays. So what I would say to my friends on this side of the aisle, you're measuring the base text, which says nothing about what we're going to do, to this amendment, which specifically spells out those things that have to occur before anybody can move from temporary status to green card status. Some people have talked about the cost. This is a $46 billion investment. Much of it is one time. But the fact is that this only goes in place if the bill passes. And as you know, the bill generates $192 billion to the U.S. Treasury over a 10-year period. I've never had an opportunity to vote for a bill that did that. Lastly, let me state that Governor Brewer, who knows more about border security than I think anybody on the Senate floor. She's been dealing with that in Arizona for a long time. Today she said in front of a national audience that this, in fact, was a victory for Arizona if this amendment could be passed. CBO has scored this today, and I want to tell all my members that as opposed to the base text, which again just says that a plan will be put in place after 180 days, we don't know what that is, but that this will significantly reduce the amount of illegal immigration that we have in this nation. So I would say to folks, I know there are folks that are going to vote against the bill regardless of what it says. I would just say, please, look at this amendment. This is a strengthening amendment. This is an amendment that every Republican who cares about border security and people on the other side that care about border security should support. I hope that everyone will get behind this. I think this puts in place a balance. And I think if this amendment is passed, we will be doing something great for our nation. I urge everyone to vote yes. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, we are about to vote to end debate, a debate that never really began, on an amendment that is 1,200 pages, that was filed on Friday afternoon after many senators had left town, and we are now voting at 5:30 on Monday as many senators are stepping off the airplane. This is the 1,200-page amendment. We have seen this play before. It is reminiscent of Obamacare, yet another bill that we were told we've got to pass it to find out what's in it. And unfortunately, it seems there are some Republicans eager to go along with the Democrats in the mad rush to pass this bill. In the 2007 immigration debate, close to 50 amendments were considered. In this debate, only 9 have been debated. I introduced 7 substantive amendments to improve this bill. Not a single one has been considered on the floor of the Senate.
Would my colleague yield for a question?
I would happily yield, except that we have just 5 minutes left, and unless...
I would ask unanimous consent that I be given 1 minute both for the question and the answer.
Is there an objection?
assuming the time does not come out of my own, I have no
So that's
objection.
part of my request. Does the gentleman deny that of those 1,000 pages, about 100 pages are new text, the rest is just the old text of the existing bill, and that every senator over a weekend should be able to read 100 pages of important legislation?
As my friend from New York knows well, the amendments are interspersed through a very complicated bill. And analyzing where waivers have been given, what the intersection is of new provisions with old provisions, is not a simple endeavor. And indeed, in this particular body, it is not unbeknownst to this body to slide something in text. And my point is very simple. What is the rush? Why are we proceeding gangbusters? And the only explanation that makes sense is there are many senators, it seems, in this body, perhaps on both sides of the aisle, that very much want a fig leaf. They want something that they can claim, we are supporting border security, when in fact this bill does not. I would suggest, Madam President, if you contrast this amendment to the amendment I introduced, you can see the difference between a bill that actually would protect border security versus something that is merely meant to tell gullible constituents that we've done something. The first and most important difference is this amendment provides legalization first and then border security maybe at some time in the future. And, Madam President, we have seen this before. In 1986, it was the same promise Congress made, and we got the legalization, we got the amnesty, and we never, ever, ever got border security. In contrast, the amendment I introduced reflects the will of the American people to have border security first and only then the possibility of legalization. Secondly, this amendment does not require operational control of the border. Current law requires that. This amendment weakens current law on operational control. My amendment would require that the problem actually be solved. Thirdly, this amendment does not require a biometric entry-exit system. It weakens current law. Current law requires it. This amendment takes that out. Instead, it requires essentially a photo ID. Now, I would suggest, Madam President, for anyone who perhaps has known a teenager, you would know that the difficulty of securing a fake ID with a picture on it is not very high. Any flea market in the land will allow it. Fourth, this bill weakens the requirements of statutes on secure fencing. It weakens current law on border security. Fifth, this amendment is not offset. My amendment was offset, so it's brand new spending in this amendment with no offset. And sixth, this amendment has no real enforcement. The amendment I introduced said if the changes within it on border security were not implemented, within 3 years, 20% of the salary of political appointees at DHS would be reduced, 20% of the budget would be reduced, and it would be block granted to the state to fix the problem. Fundamentally, this is about political cover. It's not about solving the problem. And I would suggest the approach is one we're all familiar with. It is the approach that perhaps in childhood we knew well. It is an approach that says, I will gladly secure the border next Tuesday for legalization today. Now, if we were naive, if we had not been through 1986 together, if we had not seen Congress play this same shell game with the American people, perhaps we would fall for it. But I don't think the American people are that gullible. Everyone wants to fix our broken immigration system, but at the same time, we shouldn't be replicating mistakes of the past. This amendment and the underlying Gang of Eight bill grants immediate legalization, and the border security changes will never be implemented, and the border will not be secured. That's not a solution the American people can be proud of, and I urge this body to reject the amendment, to vote against cloture, and to reject the underlying bill. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
I understand that there will be numbers of people on my side of the aisle that are going to vote against the immigration bill, in some cases regardless of what it says. But I do want to say that this amendment is not about anything relative to amnesty or anything else. And if I could just read what CBO said about this amendment to all of my members. The amendment would significantly increase border security relative...
The proponent's time has expired.
I thank you, Madam President. Well, could I ask unanimous consent for a 1-minute extension? Thank you.
Without objection.
This came out of CBO today, and I want to say this to all the members on my side, and I know that sort of know the way the wind is blowing. And I cannot read from a BlackBerry. So I would just urge everyone to look at the CBO language, which says if this amendment is passed, it will strongly increase border security and strongly decrease illegal immigration in this country. I don't know how any Republican who says they support border security could vote against this amendment when you're comparing against the base language which is in the bill. Madam President, I yield the floor.
1.5 minutes remains for the opponents. Senator from Alabama.
Madam, I would ask.
The Senate will come to order.
Madam President, this is not a vote on a Corker-Hoeven amendment. It's a vote on a complete substitute of over 1,000 pages that includes all aspects of the bill before us. It includes the amnesty. It includes the failed entry-exit visa. And if we vote for cloture tonight, we will be transferring complete control of the entire process of this immigration bill to the Majority Leader, Harry Reid. You can hear the whistle in the distance right now as the train is arriving to the station. If Senator Reid and Corker-Hoeven are able to cut off debate today, the next vote will come in about 30 hours and another substitute vote in 30 hours after that. Senator Reid has filled the tree. There will be no amendments allowed.
As regular order.
The opponent's time has expired.
Without the approval of the Majority Leader.
I want to make an arrangement. Yes,
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close debate on the Leahy Amendment numbered 1183 as modified to S-744, a bill to provide for comprehensive immigration reform and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on amendment number 1183 offered by the senator from Vermont as modified to S-744, a bill to provide for comprehensive immigration reform and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Balkus.
You got focus again.
Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein.
I can see that.
Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoeven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Markowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reid of Rhode Island. Mr. Reid of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Bitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren.
How am I recording?
Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Baldwin, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Cantwell, Carper, Casey, Chiesa, Coons, Corker, Cowan, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Flake, Franken, Graham, Hatch, Heitkamp, Heller, Hirono, Hoeven, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, Kirk, Leahy, Manchin, McCain, McCaskill, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Warner, Warren, Wicker, Wyden. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blunt, Burr, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Fisher, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, McConnell, Moran, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Bitter. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Nelson, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye.